Hey everyone. As we journey through life, I think we're constantly learning. We're learning about ourselves as well as the world around us. And sometimes I think we characterize that time of learning about ourselves as a time that's only supposed to happen in adolescence, when we have that personal angst about who we are and what we're supposed to do. But I don't know, I've found that learning about who we are is something that continues on all the way through life. And to that end, I have discovered something about myself recently that in some ways I guess I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but in other ways I guess it makes sense. I mean, it's something that has always been a part of me, but it wasn't until most recently that I've looked at my own actions and I've realized that there is something about me that other people may see that I haven't always seen. So in a word, what I'm talking about is that I can be stubborn. That's right, I can be a stubborn person. Sometimes I like to use euphemisms to talk about that. I talk about myself as being compassionate or very committed or resolute in what I think and what I believe to be true and right. And these terms, they do make it softer, but in reality, sometimes it just comes down to the fact that I'm just stubborn. Well, as I was thinking about this, I think that part of why this has come out is that during this time of pandemic, my own sense of self has been challenged in many ways. And this pandemic has pushed me to the place where I've just been sometimes flat out stubborn about things. Much about what I've learned in ministry before this pandemic is really being challenged. And I find myself looking at some of the decisions that I've felt I've had to make, and I haven't liked them. And so I've pushed back on them with this stubbornness that sometimes has caused, it's caused frustration with others. And yet, part of that, I think, is this drive to really consider what should I do and what do I want to do and what do I feel called to do and what do I feel that I need to do now. And all of this has moved me to that place where sometimes I just put my feet down and I'm just flat out stubborn. Well, this has also got me to thinking about the Apostle Paul. Now, I'm not in any way trying to compare myself to the Apostle Paul, trust me here. But, when you look at Paul, you see that he was a very passionate person and he was very committed to what he believed and he was very resolute in his opinions. And so maybe sometimes he was also stubborn. Now, I know that Paul had lots of friends in the faith, and as he continued to journey, we see, as I mentioned in the last devotional I did, that there were many people that were companions in his ministry, and these relationships were something that he really celebrated. But he also was not afraid to challenge people. Even some of his closest friends, even some of the people that he would view as close allies, he wasn't afraid to challenge them when he believed that what was happening was wrong. You might call it stubborn, but in many ways, this kind of stubbornness worked out for Paul. For example, there was an experience that happened to Paul when he was trying to move the church towards being more accepting towards those who were not Jewish in their background. He was trying to push them to accept the Gentiles. And the church really began to move in that direction, and it embraced what Paul was trying to tell them to do, but they also at times backslid. And there was a time where Paul had to go toe-to-toe with Peter, who was called the Rock by Jesus. And he had to go toe-to-toe with Peter over what Paul saw as his hypocrisy. He talks about this in Galatians chapter 2 in verse 11. He says, when Cephas, that's the other way to talk about Peter. So when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, Paul writes, because he stood condemned. For before certain people came from James, he used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles, because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Now, what he's talking about here is he's talking about those who believed you had to go through the experience of circumcision in order to be acceptable. And Paul stood against that. He said these Gentiles are not acceptable because they have or haven't been circumcised. I mean, that was something that was really important in the Jewish faith. And so he says, when these folks came from the background where they believed that that was what you needed to have, all of a sudden, Peter began to back off. And he said, that's wrong. And he goes on to say, other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. You see, this is one of those places where Paul stuck his feet in the ground and he said, absolutely no compromise. The Gentiles should be received just as they are. There is not anything you can compromise on that one. And if you try to, that's utter hypocrisy. Paul was stubborn? Well, perhaps. But this was one of those times where he was 100% correct. And yet there's other times where Paul maybe wasn't correct. There's a story in Acts chapter 15, and you heard me mention Barnabas earlier in that reading. You see, Barnabas was the companion for Paul during the time where he did his early journeys. In fact, it was Barnabas who helped introduce Paul to the Christians who were in Jerusalem. And when he did that, he was really putting himself on the line because a lot of people were skeptical about Paul's conversion. But in this one story in Acts chapter 15, there's a conflict that happens. The conflict is over whether or not a fellow by the name of a young person, a young follower of Jesus by the name of John Mark, should come with Barnabas and Paul on their next journey. Now, John Mark was the cousin of Barnabas, and it seems that sometime along one of their earlier journeys, John Mark had abandoned them. He had left them before they had finished their journey, and this really angered Paul. And Paul says, you know what, if he abandons us then, he's going to abandon us again. And he told Barnabas, I don't want John Mark coming with us. And Barnabas said, but we got to give him another chance. Sure, he made a mistake, but we got to give him another chance. And Barnabas continued to advocate for John Mark so much that Paul got furious. And he said, absolutely not. I will not go on a journey that John Mark goes on. Well, Barnabas stuck his foot in the sand too, and he said, absolutely not. I'm not going to go on this journey without him. And they split. Now, it's interesting as you read this story and you see commentators talk about him. Some of them say, oh, it all worked out wonderfully. It really did because, Barnabas got another companion and he went off and spread the gospel in places that Paul may not have gone. And they said that Paul gets another companion as well. He gets Silas to go with him, and the gospel is spread even further because of this split. But you know what? I'm sorry. I just don't think that that's the right way to see this. I think this split was bad. Yes, God worked it to good, but I think this split was bad. And I think this is one of those instances where Paul's stubbornness was wrong. It's funny because later on, Paul mentions John Mark in some of the letters, and he calls him a faithful disciple, and he talks about his leadership. And I think he recognizes that John Mark did need that second chance that Barnabas gave him. So what's the point? Well, maybe there are times when I am stubborn and I am right. But maybe there are times when I am stubborn and I am wrong. And maybe those times I risk even relationship. We can be committed, we can be resolute, we can be confident of what we think. We can be passionate about our beliefs. But sometimes we have to listen to the counsel of others. Because when we don't, we may allow our stubbornness to rule our hearts more than the call of God. So this is something I learned about myself, and if you're with me on that, then maybe we can learn this lesson together. Thank you so much.